was originally going to be the final session of the colloquium, where we would look back at the input to this point and reflect on the ways forward. We're still going to do that, but of course tomorrow we've got a day devoted to arts interventions. So I will introduce the speakers as they're ready to speak, but first of all I'll just say a little bit more about what we'll do. I've asked the speakers to do two things. Firstly, to reflect on the previous sessions this week and saying that they can really be as selective as they like in doing that. So I don't think it's going to be feasible to cover everything, but if people could pull out the real kind of highlights and learning points for them, critical issues that they've noticed and identified during the discussions so far. And then secondly, we'll be suggesting some priorities or possible priorities for the degrowth and ecological economics movements in the coming months and years in the context of COVID, climate change, and the general ecological, social, and economic crises that are confronting us. Okay, so I will introduce our first panelist, who is Vincent Ligy. Vincent, as you can tell from his name, probably is from France, but he's based in Budapest. He was an organizer of the 2016 Degrowth International Conference, and he's the author or co-author of Exploring Degrowth, a critical guide published by Fusion Press this year. His background is an engineer. He's also an interdisciplinary researcher and activist. He's the coordinator of Cargonomia, Degrowth Research and Experimentation Center and Cooperative for Sustainable Logistics with Cargo Bikes and Local Organic Food Production and Distribution in Budapest. And he's also one of the spokespeople for the French degrowth movement. So over to you, Vincent. Interesting to hear what you have to tell us.
Well, thanks a lot, Mark. Before starting to raise a few points based on what I could listen since the beginning of this symposium, I would like to congratulate you and your team and John and all the rest of the team for organizing this symposium. We should all have been together enjoying Manchester in these days, but the COVID-19 situation pushed us to reorganize everything, which has been quite challenging and a lot of effort made by the team. I think it's been a big success, even considering all the technical challenge what you face and so on. That's the first point I wanted to raise. So what I could attend since the beginning really fitted with what I expected as a member of the Degrowth Conference Support Group, whose main goal is to organize every 2 years degrowth conferences and to do it in cooperation with ecological economics. We started somehow to cooperate years ago, mostly first with the European Society of Ecological Economics, because degrowth historically was more located in Europe, in the global north. And we always wanted to go back to what I think is a very fundamental pillar of degrowth, which is radical critics to development. And to do so, we always wanted to reconnect and to extend our connections and cooperation with Global South and movements from Global South who are critical with development. And International Society of Ecological Economics, from this perspective, I think is a good ally to go deeper and further in this dialogue and discussion. And it's what happened first 2 years ago in Mexico City, where both the conference, Degrowth conference in Mexico City, which was based on decolonizing our imaginaries and based on radical critics to development and radical critics to what development is as a cultural imperialistic tool, which is a continuity of colonialism and so on, took place almost in the same time than the former International Ecological Economics Conference. And that's how I would say we could go through these dynamics and so on and to cooperate together with Manchester. And I think it's been a success. When I see the discussion we had on the first day, the opening panel was exactly focusing on dialogue or convergence or cooperation, or how to be complementary, how to work together between ecological economics and degrowth. And a lot of questions has been put on the table. Also a lot of misunderstandings, because degrowth is bringing a lot of misunderstanding. We could see them arriving back again, and thanks to my degrowth colleagues who try to clarify a lot of misunderstanding about what is degrowth and what is not degrowth. So I repeat here, to be clear, degrowth is not the contrary to growth. It's more like a radical movement with a provocative slogan, trying to think out of the box, to think out of the logic of only reductionist quantitative approach, and to elaborate, to rethink new models of society, which would be based on other values. And we could have these discussions and so on. And from what was my main point in cooperating with each other, radical critics to development, I think yesterday it was a very interesting and successful afternoon, with a lot of people from indigenous communities, a lot of people bringing other views on the challenges that we face, in particular in this particular situation of COVID-19. And I could hear a lot of radical critiques to development coming from people from Maya communities or Sami communities, for example, which is very interesting to hear the point of view, which is converging with a degrowth approach, which started in Europe. Also, after the opening panel on the first day, and Suzanne, who will speak after me, participated in it, was focusing particularly in something which was really in the center of the debate, or what the COVID-19 revealed. The question of ecofeminism and the question of care work, and how it's been unfairly shared and also unfairly supported in our societies for decades. And to have a particular panel focusing on this issue with the collective FADA, which is an ecofeminist degrowth collective, what I really find interesting, and which was born, and I'm very happy with that, which was born during the degrowth conference in Budapest 4 years ago. It was very important to come back to that, because it opens a lot of questions which were in the center of the debates during the COVID-19 crisis, during the confinement that we all faced in the spring, and to around the question what we raise in our book, and around the question what we raise in several articles with my co-author Anitra Nelson, who couldn't participate today because she's in Australia, so she should be sleeping, I know, and I wish her a good night. About what really matters. The time of COVID-19 pushed a lot of people to suddenly realize how important are all these hidden tasks in our capitalist society, and maybe how we should put them back in the center of our organizations and so on. And to conclude, because I think I have a limited time and I hope I am not too long, the former session is also, I think, very important, and was very interesting to bring some questions about work, about production, about technologies, about how to reorganize the society. And I think it will be in the center of the discussion today, and it will be in the center of the upcoming discussion and the strategies for ecological economics and degrowth in the upcoming months, because I'm afraid we are about to face a terrible economic crisis, which will mean a lot of unemployment, and which will mean radical thinking about how to reorganize, how to decolonize also our imaginary, which is centralized around the work values and so on, which is centralized around capitalism and productivism and so on. And the key question will be how to rethink work, and how to reorganize an open dialogue with unions, with a larger part of society which will face these rising inequalities, how to rethink the way we identify what really matters, what are our basic needs, and how do we fulfill it in a meaningful way, in reorganizing our economies, and reorganizing our relationship toward work, toward care work, toward sharing the hard task and so on, and also protecting our communities. So I hope I was not too long. Thank you.
Thank you very much. No, that was perfect timing. So some interesting points, and a great overview of what we've done so far. I'll now introduce our next speaker, who is Susan Paulson. Now, many of you will have virtually met Susan earlier in the week, which was also part of the feminism and gender session. Susan explores how class, gender, and ethno-racial systems interact with environments. She's researched and taught in Latin America for 30 years, 15 of those living in South America among low-impact communities. She's currently based at the University of Florida. She's interested in conversation across difference within and beyond the classroom, and especially in workshops, and she's facilitated those in many countries. Susan is the co-author with a number of other authors of The Case for Degrowth, which came out, I think, last year, Susan. So over to you.
Thank you, and thank you all to the organizers. So today, leaders around the world are scrambling to relaunch economic growth while media fuel antagonisms between economy and public health, jobs and environment. How can we reorient worlds around well-being and regeneration of life? I think people gathered here this week are working in many ways to make change happen. Some adapting policies and institutions, others widening epistemological horizons, many working to build healthier livelihoods and communities. I've been tracing historical adaptations through which social systems have been harnessed to facilitate economic expansion and seeking change towards systems that might be more equitable and sustainable. Ethnic systems that do not racialize certain humans as inferior, justifying the appropriation of their bodies and natural resources. Gender systems that do not extol market production as marker of superior masculinity, nor relegate care and production to inferior feminine realms. At this conference, it's been wonderful to learn so much about class, gendered, and ethno-racial dimensions of our shifting economies and livelihoods. That attention allowed Annie Moon to show us higher rates of infection amongst Navajos versus whites, and established that 70% of her tribes live below poverty line. Selma James and Nina Lopez to advocate care income to address power distinctions between commoditized and non-commoditized workers. Today, we heard the Lucas Aerospace Combine talking about forging collaborations among white and blue-collar workers. Starting with remarkably high COVID rates among men compared to women, I applied intersectional analysis to reveal that concentration in low-income and non-white men, many doing essential work like sanitation, meatpacking, truck driving, others confined to prisons, agricultural labor camps, migrant detention centers. So participants here, I've also heard them look critically at the historical genesis of these categories we're using to analyze the world and their ethnocentric limitations. Amid contemporary identity politics based on individual actors, Josephina Skirk said, "If I don't wear traditional clothes or speak Sami, I could assimilate to Swedish society and escape dissemination. But what about the land? For Sami, ethnicity doesn't make sense without territory." Brazilian Ailton Krenak describes the historic invention of race as a mechanism to dominate physical and social bodies as utility in the expansion of colonial production systems. This contrasts with indigenous senses of life as gift and informs Ailton's discomfort with financial valuation of ecosystems, which he conceives as life itself, not just economic utility. We've also glimpsed some ontologies underlying these social systems. Manuel May observes that whereas we Christian humans enjoy divine right to dominate nature, Mayans ask permission to impact any other being, each perceived as sacred. Felipe Milanez and Janet Carhualca and others consider economies and livelihoods in frames of colonization. They're describing epidemics of the 1600s and COVID today as weaponized to advance conquest. Similarly, African-American Kevin Williams looks at modern policing as historical continuation of slave patrols that was followed by KKK. Co-learning across these really different points of view and life is vital to make deep change happen. So in our new book, The Case for Degrowth, written with Yorgos Kallis, Fede de Maria, and Giacomo D'Alisa, we advance policies, practices, movements for change including in policy, Green New Deals, reduced working hours, universal basic income, supportive community economies. Well, planetary boundaries demand reduction in material and energy used by human economies. We argue that some infrastructures and activities actually need to flourish more, those supporting care, provisioning, solidarity, compassion. Wealthier nations have more than enough resources to look after everyone if economic systems are changed. So we'd like to slow down by design, not disaster. However, it looks like transition away from growth will be unplanned and messy, like the conditions we're all living through right now. Responses will require synergy across the many diverse perspectives and movements joined in this conference and beyond. And an immediate case for including degrowth in this allied front is that its fundamental practice, modest living based in care, cooperation, and sharing, is desirable in itself. Even with no victory in sight, people can exercise and embody lifestyles, institutions, and politics of degrowth worlds to come. In efforts to prefigure caring futures, our efforts to prefigure caring futures are described in the book's preface. I'll just read a little excerpt. Writing this book is an act of care. Care for family, friends, fellow citizens striving to contribute and find meaning in the face of historical challenges. Care for people and places around the world struggling to survive the burdens and damages of growth. And care for each other as collaborators and co-authors. As in any act of care, our efforts to produce this book ran up against limits and vulnerabilities of our individual positions, class, gender, disciplinary, cultural, and other. So I'd like to end today by connecting with the lovely talk by Anna Save 2 days ago on Feminist and Degrowth Alliance, exploring opportunities in the pandemic to change our world and our lives. So the group's letter begins, the crisis we face as a global community must be understood not only as a public health crisis or an economic crisis of the capitalist mode of production, but also fundamentally as a crisis of the reproduction of life, a crisis of care, the work of caring for humans, non-humans, and the shared biosphere. This pandemic is a historic rupture, and we take this opportunity to reflect on how we can, from our very diverse positions, face this moment, organize, and collectively imagine radical alternative modes of living, those with more time for community, relationship building, and care for each other and the non-human world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There were lots to think about there. And as you say, we have focused on the very many kind of divisions among humanity and the construction of those divisions over the weeks, and done that very critically. So let's move on then to our next speaker, who is Neera Singh. And Neera is Associate Professor at the Department of Geography and Planning at the University of Toronto in Canada. Her work engages with transformative possibilities for reworking human ways of relating to nature. Her academic scholarship on the commons, ecological care and caring labour derives from long-standing activist policy engagement with community forestry and environmental justice in India. Prior to coming to academia, she founded and led Vasundhara, a Bhubaneswar-based non-profit organisation, and she led the organisation for 13 years and continues to be actively involved in community forestry and forest governance issues in India. So, welcome to Neera, and over to you.
Hi. Thank you, Mark. And first of all, for organizing this amazing event. I mean, from whatever I've heard so far, it's just been wonderful. And I wouldn't, I would probably just focus on two key issues, which I've kind of like, not so much as summarizing, because I think that's, Susan did a wonderful job of summarizing the kinds of discussions we've had so far. I want to focus on some of the, one is this issue of misunderstanding that I'm hearing about degrowth And, it amazes me that even in the first session on, in terms of conversations between degrowth and ecological economics, the panelists themselves were, especially like continue to misunderstand degrowth. And we continue to keep saying, oh, degrowth is not this, degrowth is not, in terms of like antagonistic to growth. And we keep repeating what degrowth is all about. And I kind of feel that that's really getting in the way of like really kind of taking this movement to the masses. And from that perspective, I really want to kind of emphasize on effective appeal of degrowth. How do we make degrowth as something which is, which has the same kind of an effective and emotional appeal as capitalism has? So we are countering a capitalist desire machine. And if to counter that capitalist desire machine, we need to make degrowth attractive. And we need to kind of emphasize again and again that it is about not in terms of like, it's not about shrinking of economies, but it is about expanding of life. And it's about, much more joyful, richer, fuller lives. So that's something that we need to do, and, something we really need to be thinking about. And I know we've all been thinking about that, but I just wanted to place this at the center of the discussion today. And the second, in terms of care, I loved the session in terms of like basically gender-based livelihoods and feminist ways of thinking about care. And I want to kind of like really emphasize that we need to talk about care as the, we are shifting from production-based economies to care-based economies, and care not just in terms of reproductive labor within the household, but ecological care work. So to talk about ecological care work at the center of and as a part of the future of work is really important and critical. We are at a juncture where the UN declared this current decade as the decade for ecological restoration. Most nation states are aiming to restore something like 350 million hectares of degraded lands all over the world. And almost like 1.5 billion people depend on these lands which are targeted for restoration. We are at, we are probably facing a crisis where people are not just going to lose land for extractive and mining industry, but also lose land for afforestation efforts. And so we are trying to kind of, seek answers to the kind of crisis that has been brought about because of plantation-based thinking by plantation logic again. And so instead of that plantation logic, we need to really have a system in which we can support community-based approaches for natural regeneration and talk about ecological care as care work that needs to be supported by, similar to in terms of care incomes. Instead of just wages for housework, we need to be expanding that to wages for ecological care work, which indigenous communities and people have been doing for a fairly long period of time. And I think also related to this is the issues of, related to when I talked about effective appeal of degrowth, if we can talk about convivial growth instead of degrowth, it's about kind of like, instead of talking about just always in opposition to the linear growth that capitalism relies on, if you're talking about the circle of growth and, that happens in nature in a much more general ways, that those are the ways in terms of think about conviviality and all kinds of things that really need to grow in terms of care, in terms of richer and fuller lives. I think the session on indigenous experiences was really critical in terms of like not just pointing out all the ways in which indigenous peoples and people of color and Black people are being disproportionately affected by COVID, but also to in terms of like they can also help us in searching for openings from this crisis and to counter the ways in which we are kind of just, otherwise we are just, struggling to, unravel the story that has been fed to us. And Josephina Ailton and Janet, both, all of them really kind of emphasized on that. And that's something where, so help to kind of think about building more joyful, ways of being could come from indigenous communities and indigenous leaders. And the other issue that I have heard talked about less so in the conference has been the issues of subjectivities. You know, in terms of like our ways of being and our ways of thinking are something that needs to be transformed. And if you're thinking about like my work focuses on, you know, how do people learn to care, or how do people discover or rediscover capacities to care for more than human world. And what I find is that care is transformative. Care is not something that only enriches the person who's receiving care, but also transforms the person who's giving care. And so that's an opening in terms of like, if we really want to think about richer and fuller lives, when we have to bring care centrally into our lives, not just as something that is good for the society, good for the environment, but something that is good for us, because it makes us better humans. It makes us more caring beings. It nurtures the sense of being in common with the world. So that again is something that we should be emphasizing on. And in terms of how can we cultivate other than capitalist subjectivities? What are the conditions in which other than capitalist subjectivities are nurtured? How can we expand those opportunities? How, you know, I think of the commons as sites at which these kinds of subjectivities are cultivated. So that would be another arena in which to focus on in terms of like expanding opportunities for encounters with nature and expanding opportunities for caregiving so that we can be transformed in that process. So those were, I think, the points I wanted to make, and I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Neera. Some interesting things for us to reflect on and discuss later there. So we're now going to go to Rajeshwari Raina. Is it Raina or Raina? I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your second name. And she is a professor in the Department of International Relations and Government Studies at Shiv Nadar University, Uttar Pradesh in India. And she says, during this difficult year, a co-edited volume with Francois Gerber on post-growth thinking in India has attracted attention. The research goal is to establish and explain the interface between development, environment, and knowledge. Questions about science, technology, society, relationships among them, the politics of knowledge and innovation, and the substantive relationships that underpin human and ecological well-being is central to her research. Her work spans research, teaching, and advisory roles within academic, governmental, and civil society organizations and networks. So over to you, Neera. Rajeshwari.
Hello, good evening, and thank you, Mark. It's been, well, an interesting 3 days, and well, I've learned a lot. I'll speak to the specific questions that you would ask, lessons for ecological economics and degrowth ideas based on what we heard in the past 3 days, and also about where we need to take these forward and what can we do about it. So in the general ecological or climate crisis is perhaps what I'm going to talk about. Well, very, very briefly, I just want to, and if time permits, I'll also speak a little about you know, the science and technology part that I heard today, which was delightful from Phil, since talking about technology and work and how trade unions and as us as people with well, an understanding of what we want to do about our lives work towards a much more caring and sharing world. So our book, very briefly, you know, it's called Post-Growth Thinking in India. Julian Francois Gerber, who has written a lot about degrowth and post-growth thinking, and I did this book together in India. But basically to say that India does not need to catch up, does not need to repeat the mistakes of the developed industrialized West or North or whatever we call it. India need not get into, India does not have to create colonies or resource extraction, deprivation and injustice within the country and elsewhere in other parts of the world. So, and India has a really rich and wide range of thought and action to choose from to enable a post-growth world. And I'll speak a little about what we mean by post-growth in the book later, again, if time permits. But what we heard in the past 3 days was absolutely fascinating. And some of these things are, well, some of these points made in various panels were very, very meaningful for ecological economics and the linkages between ecological economics and degrowth, which we need to work towards very consciously about some things that ecological economics has not handled very well thus far. For instance, Julia Steinberger spoke about urgency. Yeah. So how does ecological economics handle time? Yeah. What are the concepts of evolution, irreversibility, environmental politics? You know, I mean, there's this web page put together by Malte Faber and others. You know, called Mapping Interplay Between Nature and Economy. I mean, there are so many, well, let's say small, meaningful concepts that have been explained there. Vikalp Sangam, which is basically translates as a confluence of alternatives in India. There are so many rich concepts that are discussed at the case studies in these alternatives that are given to us. Basically as well, let's say, screaming for more academic engagement, especially from ecological economics, from various schools of environmental social sciences. I mean, in the first session, and here I must say that I also felt a little sad about that session, that we were going back, you know, one step forward, two steps backward kind of feeling about what is degrowth and that kind of talk. I mean, I agree with what Neera was speaking about just now. Matthias's demand for strategic alliances, yeah, strategic alliances between ecological economics and degrowth, but also beyond. What are the other environmental social sciences that speak to us in ecological economics? That what are the other environmental social sciences that offer lessons? I mean, I would, for instance, plead for more Weblenian institutional economics. Yeah, institutional economics that takes us into questions of let's say what. Janet, Annie, Josephina, and Susan mentioned Josephina's intervention today, we're speaking about, you know, institutions, rules and norms that these communities, or let's say the Navajo Nation, Sami nationality, have perfected over time. How do you include and respect nature? I mean, rich lessons, but not, well, let's say not fully explored concepts within ecological economics and degrowth. I mean, we need to kind of bring this out and, as Neera was saying again, you know, make this appealing to the general public, to the ordinary politician. I mean, we know that we don't have, well, let's say, the astute, intelligent policymakers that we want, also caring policymakers that we want. But at the very least, we have to try and make this, well, let's say, bring out these lessons in a more, well, appealing fashion, in a much more positive fashion, because that's where the consumers' mindsets will change too. So fundamental to economics, for instance, I mean, what these communities presented yesterday and the day before, fundamental to economics, questions of limits, not of scarcity. The idea that society as social relationships, as communities with dialogues with each other, with democratic engagement. Today also there were two speakers who spoke about democratic engagements making these decisions. That society shapes, constructs and modifies every transaction between the economy and the environment. I mean, it's there. It's that we need to bring out more work on social systems in ecological economics and in degrowth. And that's, again, also strategic alliances with other social sciences, with other environmental social sciences that well, work on these questions. Political ecology, for instance, yeah, or conservation sociology. Where are these relationships? Why aren't we working with them? So conceptualization of joint production, social ecological systems and connectivities, meanings of use value versus exchange value. We heard all these in these discussions, especially from the indigenous communities. And the talk about sharing and caring and what it means. Shouldn't we be able to relate these presentations to, well, let's say, fund flow concepts in Judges Kirojan's work, Richard Norgaard's co-evolutionary sensibilities? Where are we drawing those relationships? We need to kind of re-emphasize these, present these in simple day-to-day language that people relate to. There's a lot that we can do together, especially forging these very strong and meaningful linkages that come out ecological economics and degrowth working together in meaningful fashions. Actually, it's sad to say working together, because they are in many ways mutually dependent, linked, well, expressing the pluralism that is needed in our understanding of our environment and our world. I mean, that's our economic world, that is. So in terms of priorities and ways to work, go ahead. I think some of these are important lessons. For me personally, I work on agriculture, so my work is mainly on agricultural science and how we know the world, or how we know agriculture in a limited way through science and through various other ways, through various other knowledge systems, right? So marked by agriculture in India, marked by diversity, by adaptation capacities of various sorts, by variability and change, agroecological and historical specificities, and all these are very important points, and we need to kind of look at agriculture. I mean, I work with a big group of rainfed agriculture scholars, activists, civil society organizations, farmers, farming communities from different parts of arid India. So Indian agriculture is about 60% in rainfed systems, right? Not irrigated monocrops. So there are select experiments that are happening in this country, and these are experiments that are already forging strategic alliances that we heard in the first session. Yeah. So how do we bring these ideas of pluralism with dignity, and the idea that it's synchronized and not sequential growth, decentralized, social and economic systems that we want, and not a centralized, consolidated, as David Parkin's work told us in the 1980s. Yeah. So what is this internationalization of agriculture? What are we talking about? We need to bring this back to the local system. So, and ecological economics teaches us about substantialism and the real economy. We heard several cases of people working together to achieve this in the past 2 days. We also have a small experiment that's very new that started in India called Teachers Against the Climate Crisis, where a group of teachers have just come together, just as a small platform, but to make meaningful changes within this teaching learning community. I mean, how do we teach things differently? How do we get people to understand that many of these lessons that we have today are not there in our curriculum? How do we bring this to the curriculum? How do we get people to work on these? Both bringing these into environmental justice, for instance, is perhaps the biggest linkage between ecological economics and degrowth thinking, and that's a big converging point. So how can ecological economics work towards preventing environmental justice crises, or preventing, or let's say, pointing out this is the tipping point where you will hit a conflict point. Let's not get there. Let's stop this. How do you avoid a tipping point of this sort? There are main questions of the sort that we can work towards, and many of these were discussed in the past 3 days. I'll stop here and wait for a second session if there is an opportunity, but thank you very much. Bye.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed. So we've got one further speaker who is Bathsheba Demuth, and Bathsheba is Assistant Professor of History and Environment and Society at Brown University in the USA. An environmental historian, she specializes in the lands and seas of the Russian and North American Arctic. Her multiple prize-winning first book, Floating Coast, An Environmental History of the Bering Strait, which came out last year, explores the past 200 years of energy uses, animal lives and human transformations in both the capitalist and communist Arctic area. Her interest in northern environments and cultures began when she was 18 and moved to the Yukon Territory, where for 2 years she mushed huskies, hunted caribou, fished for salmon, and otherwise learnt to survive in the taiga and tundra. She is currently working on a biography of the Yukon River from colonization to climate change. So welcome, Bathsheba. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Josh, for this introduction to the worlds of ecological economics and the degrowth communities. I should say from the beginning that I am neither an economist nor an ecologist, and I'm actually quite new to this kind of world of degrowth, and here as a very interested participant, but what I'm going to be saying today comes from the perspective of an outsider. And an outsider who's trained, as Mark said, as a historian. So my training is as a historian of the United States and the Soviet Union, And I am particularly interested in the ways in which both the socialist and capitalist worlds have interacted with environments and often have tried to extract value from them. And what I wanted to talk about today is some things that have come to mind in listening to the talks over the past 2 days, quite wrapped. They've been really interesting and I've learned so much. And what kept coming up for me, which is probably not surprising because I'm a historian, is a moment in the past. I think the moment that has come up for a lot of people this year who are historically minded is 1918 because of the influenza pandemic. And there have been, I think, many useful comparisons and parallels made with that period. But as I was listening to the panelists over the last couple of days, what's come up for me is actually an earlier period in the 20th century, 1915, or even as far back as 1905. And I kept thinking about this very early period of the 20th century in Russia in particular. And I've been thinking about it because this is a moment of extraordinarily sort of potent discontent and political foment in the Russian Empire. The Romanov family, who had been ruling that territory for considerably longer than the United States has even been a country, were starting to exhaust their political legitimacy with the people that they ruled in highly diverse territories that begin in Finland and end at the Pacific Ocean. So the sense that autocratic monarchy as a political system was starting to kind of grind to a halt. And for many people in the Russian Empire at this time, it seemed like nothing was working. The country was incredibly unequal. The serfs had been technically freed from essentially being owned by aristocrats, but there was still massive inequities between peasant labor, between the merchant class, and between the aristocracy. The country was less industrialized than Europe, had lower life expectancies, was less agriculturally sophisticated than the United States and other places that it compared itself to. And as other historians have argued, it was a moment that was incredibly full of people prophesying the end of the world, that this way of being could simply not continue. It was too unjust, too kind of riven with contradiction and human suffering. And I heard echoes of this when listening to the panelists over the last few days. This sense that time has run all the way out on our current way of living, whether it's the inequities of American colonization that Annie Moon discussed in terms of COVID-19 infections on the Navajo reservation, or the way that Kevin Williams brought in the legacies of slavery that are still lived in the United States today, to Selma James' reminders to attend to care. And in fact, that entire panel on kind of feminism and degrowth, emphasizing the ways in which care has been kind of eliminated from economic thinking and is now making a resurgence. And then, of course, the many voices that we heard from the continent we now call South America, discussing the ways in which colonization and racism and logics of extraction have transformed and are continuing to transform their lives. So in some sense, the kind of way in which people in Russia were imagining that the center could not hold in 1915 seems very familiar to the way in which people all over the world are speaking of that now. And in Russia, this obviously built into the revolution of 1917. I've spent quite a bit of time as sort of a professional hazard hanging out with the Bolsheviks, so to speak. And I take this from them. They were deeply committed to undoing the ills that they diagnosed in the Russian Empire and indeed in the capitalist world at large, and many of those same ills that we've discussed at this conference. Inequity between races, between genders, between ages, between people in different national communities. And when Lenin's party came to power in 1917, they ushered in this brief moment of tremendous, fabulous imagination of what the world might be. And many of the talks, I hear echoes of this again, a world where care is not invisible, but is central, where all lives are treated as equal, and a capacity to imagine justice and compassion as political platforms. And in that sense, I think there is something that we can learn from the Bolsheviks and their project. They really believed that it was possible to make a kingdom of justice on earth, and there are worse things to dream. I think there are also some cautionary notes, however. One is that the rupture with the status quo that allowed the Bolsheviks to come to power, even when the status quo was so terrible in Russia, took a kind of upheaval that was significantly more profound than the COVID-19 experience that we have had so far, which is deeply disruptive and very tragic. And as somebody who has had COVID and has one of these long cases that has trailed on for months, I can say, I'm not saying this lightly, but the kind of preconditions to revolution are not automatic. It took an incredible level of political turmoil within Russia, and it took people committed to taking out of that moment a new agenda for the way in which politics should be conducted. And I think we've heard people over the last several days speak to that very directly, the kind of need to take advantage of this moment and not assume that there's something automatic in the experience of disruption that we've had in the last 6 months that's going to transform our world. The other thing that the Bolshevik case makes very clear, and that I think has come up again in some of the remarks already this morning, is that economies are ideological projects and political ones. The way in which academic life can sort of silo an economics department from a department that studies politics, from departments that study human culture, are not in fact how we live this. And the Bolsheviks were very committed to the idea that socialism was not supposed to be a part of life, but all of it. And that is that we need to change the world through concrete policies, but also through ideological views. And here again, I'm echoing some of our previous speakers this morning. And kind of where I'd like to end this is in thinking about the kind of ideas that need to motivate us and how they seem so different to me than the ones that motivated the Bolsheviks, as much as I sometimes find them inspirational in their commitment to their cause. And that is that the kind of justice that socialism, like capitalism, if you can imagine capitalism as just, tries to bring to the world, imagines kind of the space in which justice can take place as restrictively and purely human. That is, the people or the beings that we are taking care of are really restricted to human beings rather than to larger ecological spaces. In the Bolshevik case, as in the capitalist case, this kind of emphasis on taking care of human beings ahead of everything else leads to logics of extracting energy and other resources from the non-human world in ways that actually undermine our capacity to bring justice to anyone, and certainly to bring wealth only to a very few. In the Bolshevik case, this allowed kind of the construction of this idea of a beautiful utopian future. And the task that I think sits before us, or that I have taken away from listening to the talks over the past few days, is the kind of critical point of thinking of a politics that can imagine a world that we want to live in and build together. It's not based on ideas of linear growth, but instead can construct that same sort of ideological drive and real capacity to inspire commitment from people out of one that takes the cyclical rather than linear nature of human life and life on the planet more into account. That is, having an ideological framework that's a way of envisioning a future that embeds people in the diverse forms of life that support us, rather than imagining economies and human politics as something that floats above that ecological world and is separate. And I think these are things that all of the speakers have touched upon in very different ways, and that will require what is to me really exciting intellectual and political dexterity of all of us in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So those were really excellent overviews and perspectives. For me, a number of things kind of came out sort of which overlapped between speakers. So we had people reflecting on a degree of frustration, really, in terms of the need to keep clarifying, explaining, and dealing with misunderstandings and misconceptions. And that, in a way, also connecting to the urgency of the of the agenda that we're faced with, that we don't have time. As the chief minister sort of said, time is run out, but also that that means that there's a huge political kind of challenge and a communication challenge for degrowth and ideas that come from ecological economics, for example. How do you get those over in ways that are attractive while also building movement? There was a big emphasis, I think, across all the reflections on learning from other traditions, from other peoples, from other perspectives. And also, I think some of the you speakers were kind of pushing the envelope on that a little as well. So we've already heard, for example, about moving beyond the alliance between degrowth and ecological economics, but also bringing in indigenous worldviews, decolonization, perspectives on care. I mean, one thing that occurred to me, for example, was that I haven't heard a mention of permaculture, for example, in this whole conference so far, and yet that is structured very much on care for people, care for the planet, care for the earth, as a kind of almost like sort of meta philosophy that underpins the whole thing. But also the work of people like the little known German Costa Rican economist and liberation theologian Franz Hinkelnet, who asked the question, well, what would happen if you tried to structure the discipline of economics and the discipline and the governance of the economy in terms of the reproduction of life, in terms of the centrality of life, which I think is a really interesting idea to rethink perspectives. But also, I think, as Rajeshwari sort of mentioned, there are a number of other intellectual resources that we haven't even begun to consider here in terms of other disciplines, institutional economics being one of them. And also then kind of pushing the envelope in terms of this isn't just about humans, but it's also about nature, about other species, about other systems and existences. So those, I think, were all very, very profound points that have come up across the contribution so far, and indeed across the conference to date. So what I would like to do now is give the speakers just a brief chance to respond to anything that any of the other speakers came up with. And I'm going to give you, I think, just 2 minutes each to do that. So really concise points. And I'll ask each of you in turn to do that. And then we'll open it up to general questions from the audience. And again, a reminder, if you can, to use the chat function on Zoom, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And if you type the questions in, indicating, if possible, who the question is orientated to, that's appropriate, using block capitals for the person's name. It just helps us to kind of analyze and prioritize the questions. Thank you very much. So over to Vincent, I think, again, in the first place, we'll go in the same order before.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks everybody for this very brilliant point. So it's a bit frustrating to have only 2 minutes to reflect on that. I would take time to open the debate on every point which has been raised. So I had to decide on the list of the things I wanted to share, and I will focus on what was a bit addressed to me maybe by Nira, because I am a degrowth activist for 15 years. I am from France, and degrowth started in France with that provocative slogan, which is a bit absurd, décroissance. And the point I would like to share, and we develop a bit in our book with Anitra, this historic part of the world. And I think it's an important part. And what is very interesting in the history of décroissance in France, that it was invented as a provocative slogan by somebody who was a project manager in a marketing advertisement corporation. And he did choose this word because he was seeing how sustainable development was used by his former colleagues to keep on doing the same in pretending that we are questioning the system. And he thought And he said that knowing how the system is working, dominated by advertisement, dominating by communication, dominated by a strong tool of manipulation of our imaginary, and very strong and effective tool. And the guy I'm speaking about, Vincent Chenet, is also very good in psychology, social psychology, psychoanalysis. So he knows very much how his colleagues dealing with communication every day are playing with our brains, are manipulating our brains to somehow empty from its content every slogan and so on. And for 15 years, I've been a degrowth activist and I've been dealing with degrowth and so on. I've seen, I don't know how many positive narratives of slogan being totally co-opted by the system. And I heard about, and I will be provocative, I heard about convivial growth. But unfortunately, you can see nowadays already some advertisements selling you cars in the name of convivial growth, that you see a wonderful family happily riding bike in the forest together, and they go with the car to the forest to do so, and so on. And we are a bit in, we have to face this challenge and contradiction that on one hand, we see behind degrowth a lot of very positive slogans, ideas, emancipation, justice, care, whatsoever. I can use a lot of very positive words and so on, but somehow we also need to have this tool, which doesn't have to be everywhere all the time. It's not like a new religion. It's not like a fetishism of the world and so on. But I think degrowth is a fantastic tool to be connected to a lot of other types of slogan, a lot of other type of networks, group, IDs, flags, narratives, and whatsoever, to always be there, to always push you to question what you say, to avoid to be co-opted, and to avoid to fall into simple solutions, false solutions, which will create even more problems and so on. What we could see in the last 2 decades with a lot of slogans like organic, fair trade, inclusive, smart, convivial growth, sustainable development. I mean, I could have a lot of slogans which have been invented and which were just making the system to still do the same in pretending to do something different. So I would argue for keeping degrowth as a fantastic semantic tool, but also to be flexible. I heard the word dexterity, sometime to be able to use other type of word and to always find the balance. And that's why I think degrowth makes sense when it's articulated into a horizontal open network, where we don't really know where are the borders, but it's really the idea to always provocate, to go deeper into the debate, what we are doing today, and to connect the people, why debating, why opening even more dialogue, which is quite demanding, but unfortunately we have to go through, because we are facing complex problem, and you cannot solve complex problem with only very simple positive slogan. You have to go to type of demanding work, intellectual work, discussion, and clarify the things.
Thank you very much. And over to you, Susan.
Wow, I agree with Vincent that there's just so much to talk about. I wish we could all be together in a bar all night long. Anyway, I'll start with one thing that really prompted my thoughts when Bathsheba observed that the magnitude of disruption that pushed the Russian Revolution was so much deeper and greater than what we've lived now. And my way of understanding that really is something that everyone here mentioned, that economies are not only material, but always also ideological, political, subjective. And I live in a country where our president told us that our economy was the greatest in the history of the world, and then we got hit by COVID, as if it was this totally external thing. And I see that if we believe that, we're never going to have a Russian Revolution, not even close, because we're just not in the frame to think about COVID as coming from the ecological and economic dynamics and trends that we create and choose, right? As did HIV, SARS, MERS, etc. So I'm sort of struggling to think, how can we reframe things so that every newscaster and every newspaper doesn't continue to repeat that we got hit by this external meteor that was COVID, and instead say we produced the conditions for this pandemic, right? And we're living them. And one thing I've been thinking about is, for example, the plague in Europe. The plague, which over centuries happened, right? But I mean, our understanding in retrospect is that population density, desperate conditions for workers contribute to this kind of situation. But it took centuries of repeated outbreaks before people responded by getting public health, water systems, and also so many people died that workers could demand more dignity and more right in order to improve their living wage slightly, right? Will it take us centuries? I mean, this again, I'm getting back to this idea that people brought up about time and the urgency, right? I wouldn't like to be suffering these waves for centuries and continue to say, oh, it's so bad that this outside thing hit us. Let's power through with our status quo, right? So that's one thing I'm thinking about.
Thank you, Susan. So Neera next, and before I bring you in, Neera, I need to apologise. I didn't mention your book when I introduced you before, which is co-edited with S. Kulkarni and N.B. Broom, and it's called Ecologies of Hope and Transformation, Post-Development Alternatives from India. So again, it's another one to look out for. And I'll put up those books later on at the end for people to refer to. Although they're also on the panelist information document, which you can access via the Eventbrite site. So you can find all the information about people there. And I did edit what some of you said about yourselves as well in the presentation. So over to Neera.
Yeah, Vincent, I was just trying to be provocative, and I have myself written a article kind of making a case for degrowth even for the global south. So basically saying that as a provocative slogan, it's not something that usually in terms of like this kind of a binary between global south and global north, kind of trying to dismantle those binaries and kind of really say that it is an absolutely useful and provocative slogan. But it is also, I mean, I was frustrated when I heard Beena Agarwal kind of talk about, okay, fine, global, in terms of we still need growth because, we have poverty and, we need to be addressing those kinds of issues. While, I definitely strongly feel that we do have a case for degrowth even in the global south. And so in terms of like what needs to grow and the ideas about linear growth versus cyclical growths are something that are relevant universally all around the world at this particular point of time. So I was just trying to be provocative. I've, nothing wrong with kind of like, and I use degrowth so extensively in my classes. But I think the idea is also to kind of effective appeal of trying to focus on, more joyful lives rather than shrinking of economies, and which is what people generally kind of like, think about when they think about degrowth. So that's all, and back to the others. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was delightfully sweet, relatively short. Rajesh Fiery, you're next. You need to unmute, please.
Yes, thank you. I did. Yeah, okay. Very, very, very briefly. I mean, yes, I have. I said I would like to come back on the question of science, which I couldn't resist once I heard Phil speak about in the previous session and in session 6 on the relationship between work and technology. At the IC conference in 2018 in Puebla in Mexico, we had actually included, I was one of the board members at the time the concept note was organized and so on. So we actually put science in the agenda to discuss science and the scientific basis of many methods and measures and so on. That was the least manifest, least represented in the conference. And today, given our crisis with growth and all these issues that we have, we have to address the question of science and technology as something that is, again, not just about capitalism. Look at our so-called communist countries. They're also, as Bathsheba rightly pointed out, are completely taken over by this kind of, let's say, fascination with technology. We can, and therefore we ought to, yeah? So because we can burn these forests, because we can cut these down, we ought to, and that's the way, I mean, every nation state today is behaving, irrespective of whether they are capitalists or communists or whatever else. We heard some of the communities speak about this. So they wouldn't figure in any of the science policy dialogues or the so-called international assessments which have science policy platforms and so on. So there are many questions about how legitimate these platforms are. The institutionalized frameworks that we have now, science policy frameworks that we have now, how legitimate are they? I mean, how do they represent all of us? I mean, how do they represent different ecosystems? Who are we talking to? And I think that is something that we need to look at very carefully. At least at the next conference, we should bring that in as a major component of our dialogue. I mean, and coming back to what Vincent was saying, solutions that come from communities and with community participation has to work with the state. I mean, we have to find, there are a few examples in India where there have been intelligent policymakers and local governments working with these local communities, and that way there is some silver lining there. I'll stop here, but just say that, we have a much bigger agenda for the next conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Shiva, to round up.
This is going to be a hard task in 2 minutes, but it seems like to pull together what a couple people have said, what Susan have said, and what Rajaswari said in her opening remarks about the need not only for kind of technical solutions or ways of modeling economies and ways of understanding how ecology functions, but also to have kind of a subjectivity shift or a way in which there is an ideological change. One thing that I have found to be hopeful on this front, as I've been on book tour and in my role working with undergraduates, is that there is a real hunger for that kind of changed thinking. I think that particularly the younger folks that I work with are completely exhausted by the models that they have been handed, and are completely aware that they don't work, right? If you were born in the United States, around 9/11, the sort of first major political event of your life that most of my students now can remember is the financial crisis of 2008. And they are now watching another financial crisis. So the idea that this system is working, even for the students who are quite well off, is so patently a fiction. And I think the question and the thing that they are discussing amongst themselves is, what do you put in its place, and how do you not motivate them, right? They have plenty of motivation and they're interested in living in a world that doesn't look like this one. It's, what are the models for taking the power for the models as they currently exist. And, I think for myself and for them, the options are somewhere between gradual change, which is frustrating and perhaps too slow for both the social injustice and the ecological injustice that we face, or revolution, which is very scary and doesn't necessarily turn out the way that people anticipate. But that the role of being able to articulate a world, and the words degrowth or ecological economics are part of that, but it's obviously a piece of a kind of bigger vision that can offer people a reason to change the way that they live now. Seems like a sort of potent call for all of us, and one that we can all contribute to in some way.
Indeed, thank you. So we're going to questions now from the audience, and I'm going to hand over to Valeria Andreoni, who's been monitoring the chat stream and can introduce the first question. Are you there, Valeria?
Yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, so we have different questions. You can see them from the right side of the screen. There is a question for Vincent. They say, I wonder if you have any thought about how to engage young in the Degrowth movement, for example, from the global north. It's clear from the climate environment that engaging young into the emotional aspect of available future. So what might be possible for degrowth?
So I think we are very well with, and it provides me a lot of hope with the younger generation. And with our degrowth cooperative in Budapest, Cargonomia, we welcome a lot of mostly French people from elite school from France, because I still have connections with France, and I see good dynamics towards that. And it's very amazing to see this younger generation, which is usually, because it's a reproductive system coming from the higher classes in France, understanding the challenges and say that we should stop everything. And there is a strong generational gap within these networks and so on. I taught and I gave lectures and talks in a lot of elite schools in France in the last 2 or 3 years. And I can see a very big problem between the students and the content of what they have to study, between the students and their parents, between the students and their teachers, and even more between the students and the companies where they should go to work after studying and so on. And I really believe that we have a wonderful generation of, not everybody would agree among the generation with degrowth and the ideas behind and so on, but we have a lot of networks, a lot of young people who will be enthusiastic to construct the world of tomorrow. And it will require 2 things what they don't have, I think, right now. The first one, it's a space to experiment how to live differently, because all the real estate, all the money is in the hand of older generations. So usually they don't have so much capacities and facilities and accesses to spaces to experiment something different. So we should find a way to provide them that. And it's what we try to do with our cooperative in very low scale here in Budapest at Cargonomia. It's amazing to see how quickly they occupy the space to experiment, to create their own project, to bring their creativity, their critiques, and so on. And the second point, and I will be a bit critical with them because I've been very nice with them till now. The second point is that it's, and I already speak like old goose, even if I am only 20 years older than them. On the contrary to my generation, where we don't have any sense of practice toward what we were very great to theorize, it's a bit contrary to them. So what we theorized 20 years ago, radical critiques to our model, radical critiques to patriarchat, radical critiques to a lot of problems our society is facing, we were very bad in experimenting it or applying it in our everyday life. We had to learn a lot. And this new generation arrived with good practices, understanding about the problems and so on, but the lack of political theory to understand much better the challenges what they face, and to politically or even as a citizen to act in a constructive way. And that's where I think ecological economics, degrowth, and a lot of other networks around us will be very helpful for them. And we need to cooperate with each other, where the old generation of degrowth are very great in writing books. The old generation of ecological economics are very great in writing academic papers, and the young generation brings the practice. So together we could do great things.
Thank you. And there is another question for you that I think that follow your discussion about the role of advertising. And it is about your recommendation against cooptation is reinforcing a common narrative with other social movements. Do you have any other suggestion to avoid that?
I already spoken enough, so maybe somebody else could reflect on that.
Okay, we have a couple of questions for all the panel. So one is about language and how language is important to promote an idea. So there is, for example, the system has misused all alternative one, like sustainable, green, clean, and so on. So what about to appropriate the positive word and twist it in the real sense that they have? For instance, sexy use as do you think flying private jet are sexy? Really? So it's like how the role of language can be used in order to promote the growth in a better way. If anyone wants to discuss something on that.
I would like to say something. And, in terms of, I think it's, I think this was also in response to the suggestion about convivial conservation, degrowth, growth. And, in terms of like, if we shy away from words that are appropriated by the mainstream, then we are left with very little words, value, for example, I mean, in terms of like people kind of say, we shouldn't be talking about value because it's been, so misused, because, the ways in which economists talk about value is so different from in terms of what we talk about in terms of, valuing life. But that doesn't mean that we don't, we let go of important words just because they are appropriated. So that's something that I would like to talk about. And I would also like to comment a little bit on, the involvement of youth in degrowth and similar kinds of movements. And I think if we can talk about ecological repair, healing work as the work of our times, and kind of like motivate youth as the work that is, in the climate justice movements and climate action movements, youth are actually taking on those roles and they're taking on that responsibility. But it is also needs to be presented as a tangible employment generation activity where, you can actually have a lot of work, the future of work, which is in terms of with work diminishing, the future of work lies in ecological repair and healing work. And so that could be one way in terms of involving the youth. And I'm not just talking about educated youth in the global north, but I'm also talking about, ways of tackling issues of mass unemployment in the global south, and finding ways in which creative energies of the youth can be channelized into work, which is critical for our times. Stop there.
Thank you very much. Anyone else would like to add something on that? No, so I can move to the other question for all the panel, and is a question about redistribution of wealth. And he was asking about if you think that wealth is necessary for the social, economic, and political transformation, and which are your thoughts about universal basic income and wages? Is it possible to implement this idea on a large and global scale?
I can start with the first.
I can, oh, sorry, yes.
Thank you, Valerie. Oh, I'll just make a quick link here. I definitely think universal basic income, universal services are key to ecological and social change. I want to make a link to your last question about language. I think the word redistribution is poison and we should not use that there. People, at least that I know, students, they think it means taking wealth away from hardworking people who deserve it and giving it to lazy losers, right? So one way that I'm thinking about it is that's investment in the greatest wealth of nations, not cash, but human and other natural resources, right? Investment in ecological care work, human care work, regeneration of life. And so, maybe I'm prostituting to what sells, but investment in life sounds better to me than redistribution of someone else's money. And things like minimum maximum wages can change the rules of the market. And so we don't contribute to generate this unequal distribution and then have to redistribute and people complain that we're taking money away. So I'll pass it on to other people. I know we've all been thinking about these policies.
Maybe if I could just intervene quickly, I'm a bit of a skeptic about these approaches, universal basic income and so on, partly because I'm not sure how sustainable and resilient they're going to be under conditions of societal collapse and collapse of the state and of the delivery power of the capitalist system, the creation of value and so on. But there is quite an interesting project called World Basic Income. I don't know if people have come across that. We can share the link to that because they're talking very much about making available a very basic income globally, but particularly focused on the poorest people. And that's very much based on the experience, which I do find quite persuasive, that actually putting money into people's hands is one of the best ways of helping people. It's well worth a look at their work.
Can I just come in on this redistribution point just for a second? Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So in a country like India, I mean, we've this figure that we've also used with this book, the richest 1% own more than 70% of the wealth created, yeah? So that's where we are. And if any of you, I mean, I don't know if any of you watched this, I mean, it was the worst humanitarian crisis that this country has faced. I mean, we often say that it was partition, but I think this one was much worse, the post-COVID time. 4 hours given to lockdown, and people had to walk, I mean, 1,000 to 3,000 kilometers. I mean, we're talking about thousands of people, migrant workers in their own country. Why? Because work is far away. Work is in some other urban slum, not in your villages, not in your locations, not in your local spaces where you know your resources. Yeah. So this humanitarian crisis, so dignified work and redistribution, both are essential to the future world. And how we achieve this is something that we have to work on. It may not be revolution, maybe, yes, but there has to be other, I mean, there have to be other ways of working this. And if it takes a revolution of sorts in terms of our thinking, in terms of our work styles, in terms of wealth redistribution, then so be it. But we cannot continue like this. This is a sense of urgency that we heard in the first session too. Time is of essence. We need to study questions of time, intra-seasonal variations within a farm. What is the concept of time there? Millions of years of fossil fuels buried beneath the earth that we're extracting out. So we need redistributions of various sorts. Yeah? And I think it's not just a question of redistributing wealth, but redistributing work, labor commodity proposition in economics. Who gave us that? I mean, why are we still, well, whether we are socialist or capitalist economies, we are all stuck to the labor commodity proposition. And that's absolute nonsense. And everybody knows that. We need to address these things too. Redistributing those are important too. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Anyone else would like to add something?
Yeah, I'm happy to reflect on these points because in the French degrowth movement already 10 years ago or even more emerged an idea influenced by unconditional basic income, but also with the idea on how to decommodify our economies and how to re-embed the economy. And we end up with that proposal, which is called unconditional autonomy allowance, which is somehow a type of unconditional basic income. It has the same principle that we think that unconditionally everybody on earth should have the right to have access to all the resources which are necessary to have a decent life. But we decommodify it. So it's not given only in euros or pounds or dollars or in cash, but it's given in a rights. It's given in accesses to some commons in public services. So it's related also to unconditional basic services and so on. But what is very important, I think, it's also that it can be totally relocalized. It can be totally decentralized. It can be totally constructed from bottom up. That it's something which could be implemented starting for example, with a movement locally fighting for water and to make it turn into a common, rethinking another type of democratic process based on deliberation toward this common. And based on that, you can start to distribute water for free till a certain amount of liters of water for everybody. And above that, you go into a logic of business where you pay a very extensive price. And in the time of COVID-19, people started to realize locally what really matters and how we became in our Western society totally dependent on a very long supply chains, which are totally unsustainable. And I think here we have a fantastic tool through this idea of unconditional autonomy allowance to step by step, based on transition, reconstruct locally based on reinventing democracy based on deliberative democracy to question what really matters, what are our basic needs, and how to fulfill these basic needs for all as locally as possible. So it's also based on another idea which emerged from the French degrowth movement, what we call open relocalization, that we have to relocalize our economies, we have to relocalize our life, our imaginaries and so on, but it should be open. So we should open the borders more than ever, because we also need more than ever types of solidarities and the type of dialogue and exchange on good practices and so on. And this unconditional autonomy allowance is fitting with all these degrowth principle, and also achieving what are the good principles behind unconditional basic income without falling into some problems which could emerge from unconditional basic income, which would adapt very well into a neoliberal or capitalistic system we are in right now.
Can I say something there?
Yeah.
So I also want to say that it's, redistribution is also closely connected to revaluation. So, in terms of valuing differently what is important. And so, the wealth that people enjoy, which they think and kind of like fear that would be redistributed to someone else, is a product of a value regime. Once you question that value regime, wealth automatically gets redistributed. So if you talk about value and how we value things and what kind of value regime is underpinning our economic systems, we would automatically have redistribution.
I would just add as a tiny note, I think in some ways what we're talking about is actual distribution of wealth, at least in the country that I'm living in right now. It's so concentrated in so few people. We're talking about sort of the most basic layer of providing, what we call a social safety net or something else, rather than this intensive concentration of wealth amongst a very, very few individual people. So to get back to Susan's point that redistribution, at least in the United States, sets off, people's sense that, the pitchforks are coming for them. We're actually just asking for the basic capacity to move money through society so that it can function. But which does leave it very open to kind of returning to a neoliberal order, because we're...
But one of the logics with which that money needs to also move is, for example, the water that we're drinking. I mean, sorry, you're drinking water right in this moment. is a function of ecological services provided by someone somewhere else. And it's not just nature's work. It is a hybrid labor that happens because of nature and people working together to create those services. So if you have to really value that and pay people who are providing that, then there would be a lot of redistribution happening from that perspective as well. Even though, yes, there's accumulated wealth that needs to be redistributed or reparation needs to happen. And so all of that needs to be there. But I just wanted to kind of flag this issue of value also here.
Yeah, can you hear me now? There is another question just arrived on the chat from Alexander, just a second, that is thinking if, do you think that land reform is a good way to create self-reliance and security? And this for all of you. Anyone would like to comment on this?
Can I go ahead?
Yes, please.
So yes, land reform is important, and land having, well, your own piece of land to be able to cultivate, to produce your food, it's very important. But then let's also face the fact that small farmers in the current system, having a parcel of land doesn't mean very much, because it's like well, let's say tying your hands and legs up and throwing you into a well, yeah? Because the system doesn't support smallholders. The system doesn't support, well, learning that the smallholders have, I mean, the substantive knowledge that a farmer would have. So if you're just given a piece of land with nothing else to support you, then it's meaningless. So land reform is meaningful. For instance, the way it happened in Taiwan, for instance, 98% of land was redistributed. right? And land reform did work. I mean, surplus was created for a particular, well, economic order, which may not be what we want now. Yes, definitely. But land reform works when the state works with people, when the state engages with production services, with knowledge, the local knowledge that can be mobilized locally, then it works. Land reform, just as redistributing a parcel of land, doesn't work.
I would say in the United States that land reform, I mean, if I was to be elected president of of everything and would be able to make these kinds of decisions, is that land reform would need to come with a very decolonial emphasis, since the way that land is distributed, particularly in the American West, is the result of a settler colonial logic that displaced people by taking their land, and that thinking really hard about land reform would actually include returning the kind of political control of that land to the people who historically have had the longest sense of stewardship over it, and the kind of deepest connection to it. And that obviously is different in countries that don't have the kind of colonial present that the United States does.
Thank you. Yep.
I'm happy to say a comment. We spoke about the 1917 Russian Revolution earlier in this discussion, and I'm afraid that we are back to what was a key challenge for that, to re-question property rights and to re-question how some properties were appropriated in a violent or illegal or unfair way in the past. And I think we are back to such a situation where we speak about land, where we speak about wealth, when we speak about access to a lot of facilities, and where we speak about the commons. We will have to re-question radically property rights and to promote against property right another type of condition for accesses to these all these facilities, all this land, all these commons, and so on. And the key question, I think, for this question of property rights is how to achieve it in the less violent way as possible, because history has proved to us that usually when you start to question property right, it turns into something very violent. You can create even more frustration, violence, and you have violent feedback towards that, and so on and so on. And I think here we should really explore more type of much more local direct democratic movements based on municipalism, based on deliberative democracy, and so on, and to implement type of dialogue on how to reappropriate a lot of spaces which are used now for toxic purposes, and to orient it for other type of even not ownership, but deliberative management of these places for other type of activities which would be meaningful. And I think that's really one of the key challenge. And we could see that in a time of COVID-19, where some countries, some regions started to lack of medicine, started to lack of mass, started to lack of some basic resources for the local population, and so on. How collectives self-organize themselves to reappropriate some spaces or to produce what is needed for the local communities, and so on. And that the direction we should push for, and to think about how to achieve it in the less violent possible way as possible. But it would be very, very challenging.
Thank you.
Come in there briefly. There's been quite a growth of pieces of work and analyses of land ownership in the United Kingdom. And this is a rich core country, and yet land ownership goes right to the heart of the system. The creation of the urban proletariat is based on land grabbing, on enclosure, on people losing their access to land and to commons. And land is incredibly concentrated in a small number of hands in this country too. And that land grabbing, that enclosure, worked in tandem with the process of colonization in particularly the Americas, and then later in other regions. One of the proposals that's been become really quite popular here, and again we're talking about potential alliances, is the proposal for land value tax, which goes with the reform of the taxation system, which begins then to get to the heart of taxing wealth rather than taxing income, particularly because taxing income strategies there leave a lot of the structural inequalities unaddressed. And I think that's an interesting idea. And I don't know whether there is scope for an alliance in terms of land value taxation and land value reform. It's relevant to this debate.
Can I also say something here? So I think, when we're talking about land reforms and land distribution, we haven't, we mostly kind of think about in the context of private lands, but don't think about public lands as much. And so a lot of, in terms of like, especially with conservation, when conservation organizations are talking about bringing half of the earth under conservation, then in terms of, property rights and those kinds of contexts really become important. And while indigenous people have been saying, we don't believe in this, this notion of property rights with regards to having ownership over a piece of land, they don't necessarily think of land as a property in those respects, but when it comes to, but you need protection against somebody else coming and taking your property away from you. So you need some kinds of protective measures to secure your rights, maybe rights not to kind of own and exploit, but right and duty to care also needs some degrees of secure rights. So, those are the kinds of even while we rethink property rights, we need to kind of really create space where indigenous communities can exercise their duty to care over the territories of life that they have valued and they have been caring for over periods of time, especially, with conservation also becoming a major threat to take over of these lands.
Thank you. If you can just add something more about this topic, is a very good example that we have in Liverpool, where I base, is the 1 pound houses. I don't know if you have heard about that. So basically there are plenty of streets with abandoned houses that they are kind of still good houses, particularly in the Welsh quarter, because it's where Welsh people move at the beginning of the century to Liverpool to work and to live. The houses has been kind of abandoned, and that now it's like a state of nobody living there, and the houses are destroyed. So the city council with local association developed this project some years ago, and they were giving houses for 1 pound, but with the obligation to restore the house and to live there. You couldn't sell it. And what we have seen in Liverpool has been a proper regeneration of community on these areas, with people with different background and different cultural identity moving to live in this area. It has been a good way to restore, build an environment that was already there, and to create a sense of identity of people that were sharing something. So this has been, I think, a really good example of how to restore the environment that was already existing and creating a community. Okay, I think that we have kind of gone through all the questions that we had. There are a few more comments, but otherwise, if you would like to add something or some other question, just if you can unmute your microphone and just speak and see that right, since we still have a few minutes.
There was Valerie. There was an earlier question about from quoting Julia's comment about some sectors need to be shut down. I don't know if we did that question, but I thought that was an important question.
I might have missed it, so please free to answer if you have seen it.
No, definitely. I mean, I think in answer to that question about there was a question about Julius Steinberger saying that some sectors have to be shut down. And we have to find other ways of dealing with what we shut down. So yes, we have to. And I think there are alternatives that have been proposed right from the 1970s. I mean, in India, for instance, A.K. Reddy talks about, Amulya Reddy was a chemist who worked on alternative fuels and energy systems, and well, his work about decentralized rural energy systems and well, alternative models, I mean, that work in effectively with democratic participation of people, local biomass systems and so on. There are various sectors that could be shut down, and it's not lack of alternatives that is preventing these, well, opportunities to shut them down, and also to find the alternatives to make other ways of working and living with other forms of energy and so on. And also the very important idea that we have to reduce, I mean, decommodify, yes. I mean, amongst the 3 R's, reduce, recycle, reuse, reduce is the least, and I keep telling my undergraduate students too about this, that reduce is something that we need to do too, and we can do that. It's a very, very important point. I think we should emphasize that some sectors have to be shut down.
Thank you. Any more comment on that? No? Okay. Mark, if you would like to add something or to introduce the following part of the discussion.
Yes, I wonder if it's worth us devoting a bit of attention to an issue that came up in several of the contributions, which is really, I think, about the state that we're in of crisis, of uncertainty, of there being multiple possibilities, but also multiple dangers, and that the openings could very quickly close down, and there are some very sort of serious risks. I mean, I think the metaphor of the Russian Revolution and that pre and post-revolutionary period is an interesting one. I'm also think quite a bit about Britain in the 1970s, when again the Keynesian order was falling apart, and it looked like it could have gone in 2 very different directions. And we all know what happened. It went in the neoliberal restoration of the capitalist hegemony. I just wonder if there's further sort of thoughts and reflections on how we grapple as movements, degrowth, ecological economics, and associated movements, how we grapple and how we mobilize and how we communicate in this kind of, what Gramsci called the interregnum, the period where the old order is dying, but the new is not ready to be born. What are the strategies there? What are the strategies for building a movement and for combating incumbent power that is still there and very dangerous? Anyone?
I'm happy to share what's happened in France in the last months, starting from the Yellow Vest movement, which was quite inspiring movement and contradictory in the beginning. I mean, we saw that it was going against degrowth because it started with implementation of a fake so-called carbon tax. And after the movement, after the incredible police repression, violent police repression against the movement and so on and so on, some people, including some people close to the degrowth movement in France, tried to push to implement what became the Citizen Convention for Ecological Transition. And 150 people were chosen by chance among the French population, type of representing the diversity of the French population, much younger, much older, different classes, farmers, hunters, NGO members, etc., etc. And they could work on several weekends, attending to a lecture made by a different type of experts. But you have experts which were coming from a pro-nuclear lobby, pro-chemical companies lobby, and also experts coming from NGOs or coming from IPCC or this type of network and so on. And in the beginning, it was very highly criticized because everybody thought how a bunch of idiots, 150 French idiots pulled by chance, would end up with anything meaningful, where all the experts have been working on what to do toward climate change for decades and didn't propose anything wrong. And even if it was not the most perfect condition of work, after a few weekends deliberating, they ended up with a degrowth political agenda, something which is much more radical than what the Green Party has been proposed for years in France and so on. And I really believe it's something which is really inspiring. I mean, I think in ecological economics, in degrowth for decades, we promote the idea to go more and more to direct democracy, inclusive democracy, deliberative democracy, and so on. And we had, I've been involved in a lot of projects, research projects, action research projects, which were much more like local, low scale, and so on. And here we have one more evidence with an experimentation made on the level of quite a large state, France, which shows that if you provide the right space with trust, with time, with controversial information to the people, and you trust them to think and to debate, they would end up with something constructive and so on. And very often I say that the main role of degrowth is not to convince the people about the degrowth political agenda, but rather to fight for putting on the table the right question and the right environment, in particular, to create what the mainstream media and what the actual situation is destroying, to create a type of trust between the people, to have a type of deliberative democracy, which would end up to the right solution. Because based on my experience, after giving, I don't know, hundreds of talks in a lot of environment all around Europe in the last 15 years, you never end up, except if you are with idiotic technocrats or French elite or this type of people, you never end up with a pro-growth agenda. I mean, we never seen demonstration of people for 5G or idiotic things like that. But on the contrary, if you provide the right space for the people to think and debate and so on, you end up with things which are much more meaningful. And I think it should be in the center of our political strategy to push for more and more and more deliberative democracy, and not only to try to impose our political agenda, but to put on the table what we think are meaningful questions.
Thank you. We have a few minutes, so there is another question. Yeah, just one about the role of trade and the relationship with degrowth. So if you can comment on that, please. Anyone would like to say something?
I could maybe bring it back a little bit to some, I see several questions lingering about basic income, also world basic income, which our Pope is promoting. And it has to do with questions of trade. Mark, I'm listening to you when you say what's going to happen with systemic collapse. Someone wrote here, well, doesn't basic income make people dependent? So I'm thinking of a situation now where people are dependent on markets, on world trade and local trade. And many of the people I know are selling their labor and their natural resources at extremely exploitative and arrangements and high sacrifice. And so what happens is when the trade systems change, or Mark, when the market collapses or when the system collapses, those people are screwed, right? Because they become dependent on selling their labor in these markets. Obviously, the problems also exist for a basic income, but there's one different way of looking at it. When world or national basic incomes operate, some people may choose not to engage to earn more cash, but to complement that small wage through community commons, through non-commoditized production of goods and services. And then that allows them to become less dependent on the market and on the variables of trade, and perhaps even more resilient to system collapse, because they've been complementing their small dependable wage to pay the electricity bill with other forms of livelihood and collaboration. So I think it goes both ways. I think there are problems with universal basic world income, but there's also problems with being a slave to selling yourself and your natural world to the market. So.
Thank you.
I wonder, I asked a question to the gender panel about the care income and its ultimate undeliverability by capitalism. And I also wonder about basic income. I asked the question, we've got rather short shrift on the day. as to whether you could see it rather like a Trotskyist transitional demand. I'm not a Trotskyist, so don't get me wrong here, but the idea that you make the demand, you push it as far as you can, you see what the system can deliver, but that also reveals the shortcomings, the contradictions of the system, which you then use further in social mobilization. I find that quite an attractive idea, and I could certainly buy into the idea of basic income with certain caveats, I think, but in those terms.
Thank you, Mark. Anyone else would like to comment on that, or I can move to probably the last question if I haven't missed others. That was about property right and ownership in a context of degrowth. So if someone could comment on that, if you have anything to discuss on this.
I think the question related to whether we were confusing property rights and ownership, and property rights definitely is much more broader, and so it includes and it has caveats about duties, and so it's not a free right to do whatever you want to do. But still, in terms of like in indigenous cultures, you would have a very different conceptions of property, or even in terms of that relationship. So relating to land as an object to be owned or even have any kinds of property rights over versus land as a kin are different perspectives. So that was my point about in terms of like having, thinking carefully about property rights, yet know that some kinds of property rights and safeguards are important to safeguard local communities' rights, even though their ways of relating to it might be very different from modern conceptions of property rights.
Yeah, I think one way of thinking about this, or at least a way that's discussed in the North American context, is a difference between property rights as have been a part of American state making, which is to say granting people private individual property so that they can extract, often quite literally, value from that land in order to enrich themselves as individuals. And this is behind, the ways in which the continent was settled with, force by the American government. And is carrying over ideas of property that emerge out of the Enclosure Acts in England, versus thinking of sovereignty as a way in which people collectively have, the rights to live in a place and to have their laws and values upheld in it and not have it seized from them, but that are not about kind of parceling land into small pieces that necessarily are for the enrichment of individual families only. And I think that that's very much a North American debate in a lot of ways and looks different in other places. But kind of expanding property rights here away from, if I own a piece of land, I can do whatever I want to it, to if I own a piece of land, it's a piece of a larger project of stewardship and sovereignty that connects me with other people in the society that I am part of.
Can I just come in for a brief moment on this, just very briefly, also tying it to the question of trade. I mean, the question of trade, as in, there are markets and markets. I mean, there are exchange mechanisms throughout the world. We've always exchanged things, whether it's food, cloth, whatever. So there are different kinds of market mechanisms that operate, or exchange systems that operate in the world, and we need to rediscover the value basis of these. I mean, someone in this panel mentioned earlier about valuation, well, restructuring valuation too. So trade is trade as in not this kind of global trade that we see, but exchange mechanisms that are meaningful to different societies. And here again, the question of property comes in, as nature does a lot of exchanges too. There is material, that is matter, energy, and information flowing through nature. I mean, I say this in my undergraduate class that, migratory birds, the ocean currents, I mean, they're all exchanging things. So mimicking nature and well, stepping out of the rights, well, or let's say claims to duties will be a big step forward. That is, we have responsibility, a co-evolutionary responsibility with nature. That's something that will make, it's actually what we're worrying about today is human enhancement of climate change. Climate change may happen anyway, yeah, but we are pushing it way beyond its natural processes, yeah. So that's the scary part today, and we need to step back and look at some of these duties, responsibilities, different kinds of valuations, addressing, like somebody responded earlier about you know, just the monetary measurements and money and redistribution of money. It's not just that, or not just a question of trade. So we probably have to think about much more fundamental set of well, duties, responsibilities, care, and so on. So there are big lessons that have come out of this conference pointing to all these. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And that's a good point to end on. Thank you very much. We are out of time, unfortunately. I think really we probably needed a week to cover this, the depth and breadth that was really needed. But thank you everybody for your contributions, and thank you to the audience again for your contributions, both in terms of comments and questions. We're now moving into a special session